concentrate on one, perhaps, for each of our panelists. And we tend to be a nation where we think politics is about compromise. So is there, first I'll ask Arnold this, is there or should there be a middle ground on whether encryption should be unbreakable for law enforcement?
I think definitely there should be a middle ground, and starting with, I think the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment provides that middle ground. They're not going to break into every phone of every citizen. They have to get a warrant before they even begin the process. That's what a big difference between this and a clipper ship is. It's not an advanced capability. But as I mentioned, the legal case is not clear cut one way or the other, so it probably will end up getting to legislation, and there will be a middle ground legislated, I hope and believe, because I think that law enforcement is going to have the ability to execute warrants. If they don't, that is a change, a fundamental change in the balance. So it's got to be a middle ground where they can execute the warrant.
Okay, and now, Ryan, perhaps from a technology perspective, can there be a middle ground on whether encryption should be unbreakable?
So I think it depends on the data at rest versus the data in transit. In transit, I think it's a lot harder to have a middle ground without doing something like key escrow, and historically there have been some problems when there have been attempts to implement that, both in terms of political blowback and some of the implementations that were suggested had some pretty bad security vulnerabilities. So I'm not really sure that in terms of data in transit there can be a very good middle ground. For data at rest, there certainly might be some options to deal with that. I think there are plenty of alternative ways to get into that data. So I think, as long as those alternatives exist, we have ways into data or into decrypting that data, I think that should be okay. One thing that is on the horizon that I think is something that we should be aware of going forward is there's a lot of research into something called homomorphic encryption. And the idea is that right now, if you want to have a document that you store in Google's cloud or Microsoft's cloud, in order for it to be displayed and for the spelling errors to be found and grammatical errors to be found, the cloud service provider has to be able to decrypt that data to process it. The idea behind homomorphic encryption, and there have only been very measured advances right now, so we're nowhere near this, but the idea would be that you could store your documents or your data securely in someone else's cloud infrastructure, and they can actually do the processing on the data while it's still encrypted, so it's never decrypted. If that becomes something that is, if that's mathematically possible, and that becomes something that is commercially available, I can see there being a huge demand for it, and I think that would close off one of the other abilities that we have to get a lot of this data. So I think going forward, that's something that we have to think about, but I think in the meantime, we do have, to some extent, that middle ground. As we've seen with the Apple case, they're still able to get the data off that phone.
And lastly, John, from a consumer perspective, is it desirable that we get to that middle ground?
Yeah, well, as I said, Phil Zimmerman doesn't think there's a feasible middle ground. It implies that there's a way. Now, I don't say there shouldn't be warrants and searches, but if the search is the best you can do brings you gibberish, then you're done. You did the warrant, you did what you did, you go and you take a different path. You're the FBI or friends, you take a different path. If there is a known middle ground, and I think key escrow implies you need to do something in advance, right? Yeah, so that's a problem. If you're escrowing keys in a special database somewhere so that you can now decrypt stuff when you want to in the future, that's nuts, right? I mean, you basically have just ruined the whole concept of private communication. Like I said, 2 million minus 140 years of human private communication. And now we have the last 140 years and we're arguing about whether we should have private communication anymore. I think there should not be, and I don't think there technically, ultimately, can be a safe one, a safe middle ground.
All right, and as I said, we have a lot more questions, but we're also out of time. So I think I know I found this discussion to be very helpful. I hope you did. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.